Welcome back. In this video, we will have a look at the provider package and how we can use it with roots. So just to make sure that you're not totally lost for this video, if you have not done the basics of the provider and you also know nothing about roots, then it will be a good idea to go through these two videos of mine. So in this video, I will assume that you know something about the provider package and that you also know something about roots. Now, just to not repeat a lot of coding in here and doing some basic stuff that we're actually not going to handle inside of this video, I've created a starter project for you. Well, not a starter project, but just a simple lib folder, so it's easy to download. It's not that big. So you can go to bit.ly/provider roots, and this is the lib folder that you need to download. Okay, so if you click on download, then on the right hand side, you can see it's 3.4 kilobytes. It's very small, but if we open it up, okay, let's just extract this one quickly. Okay, so if I open up this, you will see there's your lib folder with a few folders. There's the main dot. So make sure you take this one and not the root one, because then it's lib inside of lib and we're going to get problems there. So make sure you copy this one. I'm going to copy this and then we will paste it inside of our project. So back in Visual Studio Code, I created a new project called Roots and Provider Video, and I want to replace this lib folder now. So I'm going to right click there and say Review in File Explorer. It opens up the File Explorer for you, exactly where your lib folder is at. So I want to replace that lib folder now. So you're going to right click and you're going to say Paste inside of your new project where you can see your lib and your iOS and your Android folders. Exactly in here is where you're going to paste that lib folder. So let's paste it there. I'm going to replace all the files. And then if I open it up, you can see there's my models. There's my pages. It's a very simple application, but just to give you an idea, there's roots. And then there's the main dot as well. Okay, so everything very simple. So let's go back to our lib folder. Now, it could be that yours will have some problems. So if you have problems at the top with some of the import statements, you can just remove, just keep the material dot. So you can remove your import statements. For example, this one. You can remove it and then just go and use your control dot and import the specific libraries that you need. So the reason that yours will actually give some errors is because this part of yours will be different than mine. So just go and make sure that on all of these files, if you've got some problems there, for example, I can remove all of these import statements that will probably give you a problem. And then you can just go and use control dot and import those from your own package. Okay, so you can just go and sort out all of the errors there. So in all of these, this one should not have an error. The main page, maybe you can have an error there. So by removing that import statement, you could have the root manager again. So control dot will just add it. Okay, so you get the idea. So on all of these files, just go and make sure your import statements at the top corresponds with your project folder. Okay, so we'll have a brief go through the coding. But for now, let's just quickly go to the pubspec.yaml and also underneath your Cupertino icons, let's just add provider. Now, I want to show you this also. You can just use provider with a colon there, and that will basically get you the newest version of provider. And so this will work. Otherwise, if you want to have a specific one, you can go with 5.0.0 or some of those packages. Okay, so let's use provider 5.0.0, but you can use the newest one. Okay, and then let's quickly go through the coding. So in the main dot, you will see that we start my app. My app is a material app, and you'll see that in all the build methods, I have this print building my app. And the reason I do this is to show you that when we start using provider, we're not rebuilding unnecessary. Okay, and then in the material app, we've got the initial root as rootmanager.login page. If you've gone through my video, you will know exactly what root manager will do. And on generate root is rootmanager.generate root. Okay, so let's go to the roots quickly. So you'll see under pages, I've got a login page, I've got a main page, and I've got a settings page. Okay, so I've indicated them at the top. There's the login page, the main page, and the settings page. Inside of this generate root that accepts root settings, we're testing for a specific root name. If it's login page, it's going to take me to my login page, which is this one. If it's main page, it's going to take me to the main page, which is that one. And the settings page, it will take me to settings page. Okay, so you can see in here now, this is the only logic we've got in here, and that is basically just pushing a specific root. And if we look at the single responsibility principle, this is perfect because we know that everything about roots is handled inside of this roots dot dot. Now, in the previous roots example I also added something else in here in order for us to pass through data, which is not always the nicest thing to do because we're taking away the single responsibility principle here. So by leaving this class exactly like it is now, we are adhering to that single responsibility principle. This class is responsible for setting out the roots. Okay. And then it is indicated here, the initial root will be that root manager.login page, which means we will start with the main page or the login page, which will be login. Okay. So that is the roots and the main dot dot. So let's go to the pages. So in the login page, let me just start or run this application first, and then we can go through what is on that page. Right, so if we go to our login page now, you can see we've basically got a text field there. And underneath the text field, just a submit button with an app bar that shows login. So right at the start of it, you will see that I am using a text editing controller. So now the text editing controller, we've done text fields already. So if you've got a problem with this, you can also go and have a look at my video on how to use text fields. Okay, so we'll need a text editing controller. And for this, that's why this class is a stateful widget. So I can have access to this dispose function also. And this dispose will then dispose the text editing controller. And that text editing controller just keeps track of what I'm actually typing there. Okay, and you can see there's the floating hint and so forth. Okay, so it just keeps track of my typing. And then if I want to get whatever I typed, I will just call username controller.text. If I want to set it, I will say username controller.text equals something. And then when we're done, it runs this dispose, and just before it runs super.dispose, we want to dispose of this text editing controller. And that's the only reason why this is a stateful widget. Now, if I go down in the build function, you will see that we print out building login. There's a scaffold with an app bar with a text widget, and that's the login you see at the top. Then we've got a center column. The column is also centered. That's why everything's in the middle of the screen. We will have some padding all around this text field, 12 padding, and that's the space you see there on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and you can't really see top, but you can see bottom as well. Then we've got the text field. The keyboard type for the text field is just normal text, and that's why you see the full keyboard popping up when I start clicking inside of the text field. The controller is that username controller that we had at the top. I have some decoration, which is just an input decoration to have an outline input border. You can go through my video if you want to get a bit more about these borders. And then there's label text. And by using label text, you get this floating hint there. So that hint of yours, if I remove all of this, not there, on the app, if I remove all of this and I say I'm done, then you can see please enter your username seems as a hint. And if I click on it, that hint floats upwards and it becomes the label there. Okay, so that's the label text. So by just having a label text, you will get this. And this one says, please enter your username. Okay, then after this text field, we've got an elevated button. And the elevated button will show the text submit. And when you click on it, this is something we've done before. So make sure you go through my roots video if you're not sure what's happening here. But basically, we're saying go to a named root called main page, rootmanager.main page. So if I go to my roots, rootmanager.main page refers to this one. And then by passing that through or using this line, basically goes back to my root manager settings part. It checks that name and it sees the main page is there, so it takes you to the main page. Okay, and that is the login page. Okay, so we'll explain now what we're going to do. So in the main page then, let's click on submit there. In the main page, the main screen, you'll see we've got some actions at the top. So I've got a scaffold, I've got an app bar, I've removed that arrow on the left. There's some actions. There's an action button that is the settings, so there's this one. And there's an action or an icon button that shows the exit to app, which is that one. And this one will just have navigator.of context. It will take you to the settings page if you click there. And this one will just pop off the context if you click on that one. So if I want to go back to the login screen, I'm back there. Okay, so those are the two buttons at the top. Then we've got a center widget again, is the body, in the body, with a column that's in the center with a text that just says welcome, and we'll change that text now. Okay, and then if you then click there, it takes you to the settings page, and the settings page you can see is still got the back button there, so we can use it. So on the settings page, we're printing out building settings. We've got a scaffold with a text widget at the top that says settings, nothing else in the app bar. Now in the center widget, then we've got a column that's also centered, and that's why these three items is in the center of the screen. We will have a text widget that says choose color scheme for the app bar. We will have a 20 space between that text and the next button. On the elevated button, the text is blue, and on the second elevated button, the text is purple. And you can see that for these buttons, we've got empty functions, which we will add some data for. Okay, so what is the idea with this application that we're going to do today? So I'm just going to close everything. Let's go through what we want to do here. So we will start with the login page, and we're going to start typing something here. For example, John. If I click submit, it must tell me welcome, John. And then if it says welcome, John, it will also look at this color at the top, so that when we go to settings and you choose blue, this text color will change to blue. If you click on purple, this text color will change to purple. Okay, but the blue and the purple that you select here, if we go back, should also be displayed inside of this app bar at the top. So it's the same as basically passing through data. So in the roots video that I did, we did pass through data, and we can do exactly the same way again. But basically what we did is we added stuff inside of this root manager that should not be here, because the root manager should be only concerned about supplying the roots, not worried about data that's going to be passed through. Okay, so let's see how we can do this. So to start off with, we will need to have two model classes. So you'll see there's two model classes, one for the user. Now what we want to do here is to enter your username. So I'm going to save this username in this class called user.dot, or in an object of this class. And that's where the provider can help us. So in the provider or the change notifier, we create an instance of this class, and then we have access to this username. So you can see the username is initially nothing, and then we have a getter for it to return back that username, and a setter for it to set the username. And then if you pass in a new username, we will set that username to the new username and notify the listeners. So also note, this class is with change notifier, so it's a mixin called change notifier, and this change notifier will notify listeners of any changes inside of this class. So when you call notify listeners, everywhere data has been listened using this user object, it will be notified of the change. Okay, so that is to just store this username. Then if we carry on and we go to the settings page, there's also this part where we need to store the color. So the reason why I have two models here, you could have added that data also inside for the color. You could have also added it inside of this user. But now, what has the user got to do with any colors? Maybe it's the user's preference. Then it will make sense. Okay. But in any case, I've separated the two so I can show you something different also today. So if you go to the settings.dart now, this settings data class will now help me to save the choice I make here, either blue or purple for the color. And you can see the color right from the start is blue. And then we have a getter there to get back that blue or whatever the value will be afterwards. And then there's also a setter called app color where we can set that color to the app color and we notify all the listeners. Again, it's with change notifier, which means that if something changes inside of this settings data class and we call notify listeners, it will notify all of the listeners. Okay, so that is just the basic project that I actually gave you, and you can think of how long this would have taken us just to get this done in coding. So sorry about just running through the coding, but I think this is saving a bit more time. We will start with the login page. So we want to provide the data in this username, which means we want to provide this user class. Okay, so what we're going to do is to go back to our main.dart, and you can see that our main.dart starts off with my app, and my app has got this material app. Now, in order to do or work with roots, we will basically need to have our change notifier on top of this material app. And yes, some people will tell you it's bad to have it right at the top, but there's only really two ways on how you can do roots here. You can go into your roots class again, your root manager, and then instead of having login or main page or settings here, you can start off with a change notifier that will, in the builder, return the login page. And the same for main page and the same for settings. But then you are providing data inside of this root manager that shouldn't be there. Okay, so it's up to you how you want to do this. If you're okay with your root manager also handling different change notifiers inside of here, then no problem, you can do that. But for me, it's violating that rule of the single responsibility principle. Okay, so let's go back to the main dot. So a lot of people will tell you that you should not put the change notifier high up, and even Remy that created this provider has also given that tip to not put it too high up. So what some people say also about this is that if you put your change notifier too high up, it means that with every change, your whole application will basically be rebuilt, and that's not what you want, which I agree. But when you're using the consumer class, you can identify specific widgets that needs to be rebuilt, and you don't need to rebuild everything. So that takes away that option. Okay, so on the material app, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to wrap it with a widget, and the widget I'm going to use here is a multi-provider. And you can see it's going to auto-import from the provider package. And then this multi-provider will need, if you look at the bottom, a named provider or named parameter called providers. So we will have providers here. And here I can now specify all the providers I'm going to use here. So I've got two classes. I've got settings, data, and user. So I'm going to use two here. I'm going to use a change notifier provider. And let's just put the comma there and let's use the create. And for this one, I'm going to use the fat arrow, and we want to create the class called settings data. Okay, that's the one that we want to provide. And we also want to provide another one. So I'm going to copy that whole one again and paste it there. And note that I'm only using create here. I'm not using the builder here. Okay, so it's create. One is settings data and the other one is user. So basically, I am providing these two models. So if I look at settings data, it's called settings data, and user is called user. If I go back, so I am having multiple or multi-providers here, one to provide the user data and one to provide settings data. And now remember, instead of using a child there, it's always better to use your builder. So I'm going to use this whole material app there, cut it out, remove the child, and I'm going to use the builder. And the builder, use this one, and we're going to say return, paste what you copied or cut out before, and this is how we changed our My App now. Okay, so we will have multi-providers at the top to provide both the user and the settings data. And then we build our user interface, and it will be a material app with all the roots. So this is then a way to provide data from numerous classes right here at the top by just using a multi-provider. And everything in your app now will have access to this user instance as well as the settings data instance. Right, so now in the login page, so from here, you can see our initial root is the login page. So if I go to the login page now, and somebody adds his name there, so he types there something for the username. So we can say something like John or whatever. Let's say John there. And if he clicks on submit, we want to now show welcome John. Okay, so in order to do that, we will need to go into the text fields button, or not the text fields button, let's just go back. Underneath the text field, there's a button. So on this button called submit, what we are doing currently is just saying navigator.of push named, pushing through to the main page. Okay, so just before we push that through, let's make some changes on the data. Now remember, for provider, because you are inside of a function, you cannot use consumer. So nothing really needs to change on this page. We just need to pass through some data from here. Okay, and we want to pass through the data that came from that text field. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to use context dot. Now remember, there's two functions that you can use, either context.read or context.watch. You cannot use context.watch inside of a function. So that must be part of your widget tree if you want to use it. So in our case, we're going to use read. And if you remember this, it's like using provider.of context, and where you set in as part of that of function, you set listen to false, and that is read. Okay, so read automatically sets listen to false, which means it's not listening for anything. It's just going to change some data or read some data. Okay, so the type here will be user. And why is it user? Because we want to store that username, and that we do inside of this user.dot. Okay, and then if you put a dot at the end, you will see we've got access to the username, we've got access to notify listeners, we've got access to dispose, and so forth. So what did we do inside of the user class? So inside of the user class, we have a getter called username, and we've got a setter called username. So that's why when we go here and we put the dot, you will see you pick up username. So username, just like this, is calling the getter. If you want to call the setter, you will just add an equal sign there. Okay, so let me just see something's wrong here. There we go. And let's set the username to this username controller.text. Okay, let's just see what's the problem here. This read function isn't defined. So provider doesn't, the auto import actually doesn't pick up provider. So just somewhere at the top, let's just start typing provider here. And to import it at the top and remove it again. And then you should see your import statement for provider. Otherwise, you can just type that at the top. Import package provider / provider.dot. Okay, and that takes care of the problem for us. Okay, so we've got context.read. It's going to read the data from that user instance. It's going to get the username and set the username to the username controller.text. And where's that? It's basically the text that comes from the text field. Okay, so by just doing this, we have set the username text. Now, if I click on submit, it will change it. And what will happen? It's actually going to call this set username. It's taking in that username that we supplied now, the one that comes from here. It's setting the new username, and it's notifying some listeners. So at this stage, we don't have listeners for this username, so nothing will really change. But at least step one is done. We've set or changed that value. Okay, so I'm going to save here. And what's going to happen now, if we click on submit, we've changed that value now. And now we want to display it inside of this main screen. So I'm going to go to the main screen or the main page. And if I go to the main page where I have welcome there at the bottom, I want to change something now. So if I only want to rebuild this specific text widget there, it's best to go and use the consumer. So you know that whenever this value changes, welcome whoever, it will not be rebuilding this whole thing. But because we are coming from this login page, if I click on submit, it's actually rebuilding this. So it's up to you. But let's say later on in coding, you are able to change your username, then it's better to use consumer here. So I'm going to wrap this text widget with a widget called consumer. This consumer will then mark this text widget as something that could change. And then when this something changes, it doesn't need to actually rebuild the whole widget tree here. It will only rebuild this text widget. Okay. For the consumer, you will see if you hover over it, we should have a parameter called builder. So now the same thing again as we did previously. I'm going to remove this whole text widget, cut it out, remove the child there, and I'm going to use builder. And then just wait for this autocomplete, choose the second one with the brackets, and we will just say return that text widget and end it off with a semicolon. If I save now, okay, don't worry about that. We'll get to that now. Okay, so this consumer needs a type, and that's why we get this error. So the type that this consumer will listen, and you can see the value there currently is dynamic, and that's something you don't want. So we're going to listen for the user instance. So auto import it, and you can see now value changed to a user object. Okay, so this consumer must listen for that user interface for any changes, because if it changes, we want to show the username here. So we're going to say welcome, and then we want to show the username. Okay, so where do we get that username now? Value will now be an instance of user. So I can just on the value call username to get the username. Okay, so let's go back. So on that value now, so it's this one. As part of the builder, you can see it's an instance of user. On that value, I'm going to use the dot, and I just want to display the username. So let's save, and there you can see welcome John. So if we go back now, let's say we change this to John Rambo. Click on Submit. Welcome, John Rambo. So you can see we did not pass in anything to this class called main page, but we are accessing it using this consumer. And now somewhere else in coding, let's say you've got a settings, and on the settings you can change your username. This part will only rebuild the text widget if it changes. It won't build or rebuild your whole widget tree, which means it's not the whole build function that will run and update your user interface. Right, so far so good. Now let's look at this main screen also, because if we go to settings next, we want to change the blue and the purple, and that blue and purple must change this text color of this text field or this text widget, and it must also change the color of the, let's say, the main screen's app bar. Okay, so let's go and talk about the main screen's app bar. So if I go into the app bar here, let's see if we can use this consumer class now. So if I wrap it with a widget and I can use consumer, if you hover over it, you can see that the argument of type consumer dynamic can't be assigned to the parameter type of preferred sized widget. Okay, so this is a limitation then for us, because we cannot really use the consumer widget here in order to help us to only rebuild the app bar. So what happens then, if the color changes, we've got no choice but to rebuild the whole scaffold, which basically means we're rebuilding this whole build function. So if you are doing that, then consumer is not needed at all. So just note this about your app bar. It will actually rebuild your whole screen. So in this case, we don't have a choice. We will need to rebuild this whole screen. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that as well. So in the app bar, we can have then a color property here. So I'm going to have a background color, and the background color I want to get now from this settings data. So settings data will have an app bar color. Okay, so we're going to use context, and we've got two functions that we can use, and it's read and watch. So in this case, we want to actually watch for a value, wait for a specific value to come back. And the type of the data that we are looking for here is called settings data. Okay, so we're going to wait for settings data. If the app bar color changes, we want to change. Okay, so we're going to say context.watch, the type is settings data, and if I put the dot, you can see I've got access to app bar color. So I'm going to listen for that app bar color. So remember, the watch function actually listens. The read function doesn't listen. So if you're inside of a function, you cannot use watch, then you should use read. So in this case, context.watch, watch for this. And just remember that this is different from the consumer in the sense that it will rebuild your whole build function. But in our case, it doesn't really matter because the scaffold needs to be rebuilt. And also, I cannot actually use the consumer over the app bar. So I've got no other choice but to use something like this. Okay, so the background color will then be context.watch. Go and watch settings data for any changes. If there's a change on the app bar color, come and change it here. Okay, so currently your app bar color is blue. So when we save now, we will not see a change here. So if I save this, you will see no changes. Okay, because the app bar color is currently blue. Right, so now if we change this app bar color, it should basically come and change this as well. So where do we change it? Okay, so I think we are done with the main page. Let's go to the settings page now. So on the settings page, we've got two buttons. And if we click them, we want to change that app bar color now. So let's go back to the settings page. In the settings page, on this text widget, we also want to have that color. Okay, so I'm just going to use a style property here. And we're going to use a text style. And for the text style, we'll need a color. Now, the same as we did in the previous page, we're going to say context.watch. Now, this watch function, again, it won't pick up. So at the top, I'm just going to start typing provider there, just so it imports provider at the top, and then you can remove it again. So there's provider, or you can just type that import statement. Okay, so I've got context.watch. What do I want to watch? Well, in this case, again, the settings data, because settings data has got that app bar color for me. And I want to use the app bar color here. So exactly the same as we did previously. I'm waiting or watching for that same data. And now you can see that color change to blue because that is the current app bar color for this one. Okay, so now this one is blue. So it's also listening. It's watching for something in the settings data to change. Now, if I go down into my elevated button then, if it's blue, that gets clicked. I want to now go to context, dot. In this case, we will be using read. Where do I want to read data from? It's from the settings data. And then I'm going to put the dot, and I want to change that app bar color. So I'm going to set app bar color should be colors.blue. Okay. So I'm changing the data there by using context.read. I'm inside of a function, so I cannot use watch. By the way, we will do this text widget now because this is not the most effective way to do this. Okay, just want to show you the difference again between watch and read. Inside a function, you use read because then listen is false. But for watch, listen is equal to true, then it must be part of your widget tree. Okay, now we're going to do exactly the same thing for this onPressed. But instead of setting it to blue, we will set it to purple. Right, so let's see if we click on purple. That's been changed to purple. Let's go back. Purple there. Change to blue, back, change to blue. Okay, working perfectly. But now, what's the difference here? Let me show you this. Let's run this quickly. Let's go to the settings page. So I'm going to enter a name here. Let's say Peter. Submit. Now we're at the main screen. So the main page, you can see it says building main page. Okay. Now if I click on settings, it says building settings, which is fine. Now if I click on purple, you can see it rebuilt settings again and the main page. The main page is fine because we know that it updated that color. Okay. But we actually did not want this settings class to update again. So if we click again and again, every time I click the button, you can see settings, the whole settings page gets rebuilt instead of just that widget. So that's where the consumer really helps us. So yes, inside of our main page, the consumer could not help us because we can't put a consumer over the app bar. But for the rest, for example, this text view, I only want to have this changed here. I don't want to rebuild the whole page. So let's go back to settings. And instead of using this context.watch, on this text widget, I'm going to use control dot, wrap it with the consumer widget. And for this widget, it needs a builder. So I'm going to take this whole text widget, cut it out, remove the child, have the builder, wait for it, use the second one, and I will say return and paste the value back again, just replacing that with a semicolon. So if I save now, it will give me a problem because this consumer again doesn't have a data type. So the data type for this consumer will then be, in our case, again, the same settings data. Okay. And now you can see this value is the settings data. So instead of using this whole context dot whatever there, we will just use value dot app bar color. Okay. So if we save it now, should be fine. Okay. Let's just rerun this quickly. Right. So let's, from the start, we start, let's say John Rambo again. Click on submit. Takes me there, 100% fine, and you can see now we are building the main page. Now let's click on settings. It builds settings. Now if I click on purple, you can see only the main page was rebuilt, not settings again. If I click on blue, you can see it rebuilds the main page again, but settings does not get rebuilt every time. Yes, the main page gets rebuilt every time. You can see even 9 times now because we're making that color change. And that's because we cannot put a consumer over this one. So that's where the consumer really helps to identify only one part of your UI to rebuild, and it rebuilds. Okay, so this is a nice example of how you can send data between routes. We're actually not passing through data at all. We're just changing data inside of these two, and we're listening for that data in specific places in my app. So I hope that you've learned something from this video. It's a lot like the previous ones on provider that we did, but the main thing here is we're using multi-provider to provide both data for user as well as for settings data. And then everywhere in my app, I can use these two model classes and change their data. Thank you very much for watching. See you in the next one.